Gretchen Stiers, and I'm here today with Sergeant Major Robert Allen Brown, who is my first cousin once removed on my father's side of the family. And we are here today at the Rush County Community Foundation to talk with Bob about his life and his service to our country. And Bob, you were born July 7th, 1927 in Rushville, Indiana. Tell us one of your favorite stories about your parents.
About my parents?
Your parents, your grandparents, perhaps your cousin Ben Jr. One or two of your favorite stories.
Well, my father was a fireman here in Rushville. He was hired on in 1927, the year I was born. And then in about 1935, he was made chief. Well, in all the firemen's houses, they had a bell, about so big around. And it was all wired up throughout the whole city. So many gongs would give you an address, and you look in the back of the phone book and find out where it was. Well, that was Mother's job, to find out where the fire was while Dad was getting dressed. And at that time, the Rushville Fire Department didn't have a vehicle for Dad. It was a Model T Ford. And of course, in the wintertime, you got to crank the crazy thing to get it started. And he'd get in there and hit the button for the siren in the middle of the night, and all the neighbors get up and look around what's going on.
Where's the fire?
We weren't exactly the most friendly neighbors in the neighborhood. But then, my granddad, Ben F. Stiers Sr., he was a hard man.
Now, he was a farmer.
He was a farmer all of his life. And one day, his son Chase and Ralph and Ben Jr. and I were down at the barn. And he told the boys to do something, and it didn't suit Granddad too well. Ben Jr. mouthed off and had to say something smart, and Granddad hauled off and popped him one. Well, Ben Jr. started crying because it hurt. He was 4 years older than I was. I looked at Ben Jr. and he was crying, and I started crying.
Oh, you're both crying.
Granddad said, "What are you crying for?" I said, "'Cause he's crying." But Granddad was a lovable person to all of us kids. And do you remember Granddad Stiers?
Well, I was born in 1962.
Okay.
And he passed away in 1963.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
there's pictures of us, but
yeah.
I don't really have a memory of him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so he kind of mellowed then through the years. My mother told me that when all the kids were at the Hilltop and living there, that Granddad would get kind of boisterous. And Mother would say that Grandma Lillie would reach under the table and tap him on the foot. And he would quiet down.
Oh, that's a good.
Yeah. Oh, let's see. Ben Jr. and I.
Now, Ben Jr. was not your brother, obviously.
No, he's my uncle.
He's your uncle.
Yeah.
But you were close in age.
Oh, heaven's sake, yeah.
Yeah, and kind of grew up together.
More. Yes, he even, when we lived in Rushville, he came, I think it was the 9th grade he came to Rushville because Grandma Hazel came on the scene, and Ben Jr. didn't want to stay at the Hilltop then, so he moved to town. He went to the 9th grade here in the high school in Rushville. And he went in the Navy, worked his way up to chief. Of course, I went in the Marine Corps. But prior to this, in 1944, I was unhappy in school. And Ben Jr. Wrote my mother a letter and said, "Sis, why don't you send Bobby out here? Says I can get him a job at the Naval Air Station."
Now this was out in Seattle?
Seattle, Naval Air Station at Sandpoint, Seattle. And so Bobby got on a train and headed west. Got a job at Sandpoint Naval Air Station, working on PBYs, the flying boat, 2-engine, and stayed there until February of '45. And then Granddad came out to visit us. Well, Ben Jr. and I took him downtown and we went to one of the movies. And it was a comedy movie.
Do you remember which one it was, or just that it was?
Gosh, no.
Yeah,
Too much is going on
too
up
much.
here.
Yeah.
And Ben Jr. and I got laughing pretty loud. And of course, the louder we laughed, we'd slap our hands on our foot, our leg, and so forth like that. And pretty soon an usher came down and told us to be quiet.
Oh, yeah. You were too rambunctious.
Granddad got embarrassed. So we shut up and left the movie, and Granddad and I came back to Indiana then. And this was in February of 1945, so that gets ready for another chapter in my life.
It does, and I think that one question I wanted to ask you was, obviously Ben had a big influence on you. You were very, very close, and did he kind of, his going into the Navy influence you going into the Marines, or
No.
Why did you decide to join the Marines? I know there's a story to that.
Well, when I got back to Indiana then, I told Mother, I said, I've got to go into service. All my buddies are in there. And I said, I'll go into Merchant Marines. I said, those guys make a lot of money. I says,
So that's good.
that'd be pretty easy. She said, well, okay. I said, well, I've got the address in Indianapolis. We'll go up and get enlisted or whatever they require then. Well, we got to the address all right. We went upstairs to where it required, but it wasn't a Merchant Marine. And above the door was United States Marine Corps.
So there you were.
I told Mother, I said, that's all right, it don't make no difference.
This is good, just as good.
So I went in, and the recruiter questioned me a lot of things and had me fill out forms and so forth. And there was an old warrant officer who was in charge of the recruit depot, or office. And I had a complete blank on how to spell Protestant on the form.
Protestant.
So I abbreviated P-R-O-T, period. Well, when he saw that, he looked at me and he said, do you know how to spell Protestant? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't remember how to spell Protestant. He said, okay, gave me a newspaper, had me read an article in it. Now you tell me what you read.
He wanted to make sure you...
And I had at least one brain anyway.
Right, exactly.
So
this was, you enlisted in March 1945?
March 12th.
March 12th, 1945.
Yep. So then I went down to Paris Island. Recruit training at that time was 8 weeks. And you were taught how to drill, rifle range, different type of bayonet practice and stuff like that. Because our drill instructor told us at that time, he says, don't worry about anything, you're going to kill Japs. And so we set our mind to that there. And so
To that, yeah. Well, and then you, after your training, your first deployment was then in September of 1945, and you were sent to Nagasaki, Japan. Tell us a little bit about what that was like to be part of the occupying forces at that time, and what that experience was like for you.
First, we went from Parris Island, South Carolina, to Camp Pendleton, California.
Okay.
And that's about halfway between San Diego and Los Angeles. And we stayed there for about 2 weeks. And then we boarded a troop transport and went to Pearl Harbor. We stayed in Pearl Harbor about 2 to 3 weeks guarding Japanese prisoners. Then they put us aboard a baby flat top. No aircraft, they were just using it to transport us. We went to Guam. Spent about 3 weeks in Guam.
Okay, so
doing nothing.
that must have been hard.
Yeah.
I mean,
but they told us to be careful when we're in a chow line, because there were still Japanese out in the jungle that had Marine uniforms, and they'd come sneak in at nighttime and get in a chow line so they could have something to eat. Well, then they pulled up another troop transport, and we were initially told at that time then we ought to be thankful, because our destination was to make an invasion on Nagasaki. And of course, in the meantime, they had dropped both bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was in August. And this was latter part of September, 1st of October. So as we were pulling in to the harbor at Nagasaki, there was an island about in the middle of the harbor. Had a cave in it, and we kept looking and looking, and there was a big naval gun mounted in there that any ships that would have come to the harbor would have got blown out.
This was Japanese.
Yeah. So we went to debarked and we walked actually up through part of the city, and up the side of a mountain there was a Japanese cavalry camp up there that we stayed in for about a month. And then we would be going down through the area where actually the bomb had exploded. You can't imagine of the devastation that was flat as this tabletop. And this was October, and I don't know, then they didn't have all the data on the effects of the atom bomb on people.
Right.
So we don't know if we got some fallout from it or not. So, but as we would travel through the town, we passed a bridge, went through the bridge. It had cement, but it's on each side. And here was a figure. The blast had pulverized the body and left the image in the cement.
On the cement.
That was something that was weird.
Yeah.
And but we constantly saw people with big burns on their bodies and their faces and so forth. And then we went from there up into the mountains to another cavalry base, and we were on guard duty all the time. That was our function in Japan at that time. And we were receiving Japanese coming back from China. Repatriation is what they called it. And we were to take all their weapons and their military gear from them before they went home then.
So these were soldiers they were sending back?
Yeah, these were soldiers that were coming back.
back.
Yeah. And We stayed there until about April or May of 46. And that goes into another phase.
Right, because at that point you went to China. You were deployed to China, and I'm not sure if I'll say
Tientsin.
Thank you, Tientsin and Peking.
Peking.
And what assignments did you have while you were there?
Excuse me. What now?
Well, what assignments, when you were sent to China, what assignments did you have during that deployment?
It was May, I think, when we got there, and they transported us to a shell oil compound that was prior to the war. Had Quonset huts,
Okay.
the room. And so I joined A Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment. I was a machine gunner, and our job was to guard supplies going up to Tientsin. What type? Because Tientsin was quite a city of department stores, just like here in this country. And then we also had to help General Chiang Kai-shek to get his troops out of the country because the communists were taking over very strongly. And at one point in our time, we were able to see Mao Zedong. He was in charge of the what they call the 8th Route Army. And so we were standing on top of a building looking down. Had no idea we'd be fighting them in a few years.
Right. Things changed.
But we stayed in China until...
So his troops came by? Is that how you actually saw him?
They were traveling from the north to the south. And Chiang Kai-shek was trying to get his troops to the shore and or to the airport to fly them out down to Formosa. And that's where they got set up at then. But we would guard trains loaded with coal going up to different military establishments higher up. And the people would be out alongside the railroad track begging.
Yeah.
Well, being a Marine, we would just toss coal to them or help them out there.
That's good.
We couldn't see people suffering because it was getting pretty cold.
Yes, I bet. Winter coming on.
And then we went up to Peking about 2 months prior to coming back to the States, and we got to see the Imperial Palace. You couldn't go in because of the wall, but you could see the structure, the higher structure of it and so forth. And it covered a huge area. And we had a few beers one night. We thought we'd have a race. The street was about what we would call today about 12 lanes wide.
That's large.
We would get in rickshaws.
Oh my goodness.
Pulled by the coolies. At that time, the Marines' uniform was the greens, and we had a leather belt. Well, if one of our buddies' rickshaw was getting a little ahead of us, we'd take our belt off and crack the coolie on the butt and make him run faster. So, we had some experiences. But then finally it came time to come back to the States then, and so we boarded a transport and went into San Diego and up to Camp Pendleton then, and joined the 7th Marine Regiment.
Bob, you wanted to talk a little bit more about China.
I'd like to step back. I forgot to tell. If you don't understand servicemen, you definitely won't understand a Marine and his philosophy and and so forth. Our restroom was out over the Hi-Ho River.
The Hi-Ho River.
Yeah. Literally on piling out over the river. This side was the good guys and this side was the bad guys. The commies were over here on the other side.
Okay.
You go to the bathroom, you get shot at. Some of them were close, but you didn't dally around.
No, you didn't spend a lot of time.
You did your business and got out of there. I'll tell you.
There was no long lines for the bathrooms, were there?
It was interesting. I'll tell you. So now I'll go back to pick up with the 7th Marines.
Now we're back in the States now.
Back in the States now, yeah. Of course, when I refer to the 7th Marines, that is a regiment. A regiment has 3 battalions and a headquarters battalion. And I was in Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. And we would just drill, schools, just things to occupy times with. And so one day the sergeant came in and he says, got some openings down at the commissary. Well, old dumb Brown, he decided he'd go to commissary.
All right, see what was happening.
Of course, a lot of people, commissary is a huge grocery store is what it is. And so they put me in the office. I never seen such paperwork in all my life.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to hack this. He said, well, you study at it and ask questions and we'll try to get you along. Well, after about 4 weeks, they were convinced that I wasn't going to be a commissary man.
They said, how did you spell Protestant?
Yeah.
Yeah, different jobs for different people.
So they said, there's openings at Parris Island, South Carolina for drill instructor. I said, that's for me. Go from one fire to another one.
So you went to Parris Island, and how long were you at Parris Island for?
Not very long, really, in length of time. Got there in September of, let's see, 4 days. Japan 45, 46, China in 46, 47. This was in September of 47, 48,
and 48.
Excuse me, yeah. And I went into what they call First Recruit Training Battalion, and I was a sergeant. The man I relieved was a sergeant, but at that time, all the services had semi-professional football teams.
Oh.
And he was one of their players for the Marine Corps. I walk in the door and he walks out.
Oh.
Quantico was where the football team was stationed at.
Got it.
I got no training to be a drill instructor other than the manuals that were handed to me. So did the best we could. And so from September until March, I was what was called a senior drill instructor. And I took 3 platoons through because of the length of time for the training. And it was a learning session to see how you could change a person's thinking from a civilian to a military, to obey orders when you're given, not to question anything, but to do it. And that was something that was rewarding. And never had, in your discipline, or in my case, never had to lay a hand on a man. Take them out on the drill field and work their rear end off. And that's how you got their attention, best way possible.
How did you meet Carolyn, and when did you decide to propose to her and get married?
Well, it goes back several years.
Okay, yeah. I'm not surprised.
It goes back to about 1935.
Oh, okay, yeah, several years.
Yeah, we're not two chickens. The Church of God here in Rushville is affiliated with the Anderson Christian College up in Anderson, Indiana. And Connorsville didn't have a church at that time. So during the week, the preacher here and maybe a dozen people, my mother and I included, would go to Connorsville for what they called a Bible study time. And it would be held at different people's homes.
Oh, nice.
Well, this one time it was held at Carolyn's home.
Okay.
Her daddy was a mechanic and used to get his equipment and whatever was needed for parts in large cardboard boxes. Well, he made her a dollhouse, and she placed it under the kitchen table. Well, this one night for Bible study, the adults were in the living room, and Carolyn said, "Come on, we'll play house." She was 7 years old and I was 10. So we crawled under the kitchen table and played house.
I don't think I've ever heard that story, Bob. That's wonderful.
So that was our introduction to each other. And then, to try to put this all in perspective, my father divorced my mother in 1939, and mother and I moved into an apartment here in Rushville, and they were friends of ours, and Elizabeth had a nephew living in Connorsville that his wife and daughter and father had passed away within 3 weeks of each other.
Oh, my goodness.
And he was a very fine gentleman. He would come over to visit with Elizabeth and Herschel Peters. And so they introduced Mother to him. Well, they got dating. Mother always felt that I needed to have a male image in the family. And this gentleman's name was Mose Keeley. And he was an outstanding person. Very nice, very kind. And so they got married, and Mother and I moved to Connorsville then. And I went to school a little bit there. Still not liking school.
Still not liking school.
But
now, were you in any of the same classes with Carolyn then? Well, no, she was a little bit younger than you,
she
so
was
you wouldn't have been in
behind
the
me,
same. Yeah.
I had already put 4 years in the Marine Corps and came back to Connorsville. Of course, that was our home. And we started dating then. And asked her to marry me. And I asked her parents if it would be permissible for me to marry their daughter. And I got approval. I think they were wanting to get rid of her. That's what I accuse her of. And
Yeah.
we got married then in June the 3rd of 1949. And
So at that point in time, did she join you then when you were in?
I was in the active reserve
At that time.
going to Indianapolis to meetings and coming back.
Okay.
And then the Korean War started.
Right, because then your next, your reserve battalion was then reactivated in August 1950. And that's when you went to South Korea.
Yes. Yeah, I called the colonel up and I told him, I said, I want to go with you. And he said, okay, I'll cut orders for you and you travel on out to Camp Pendleton. And so I did. And then we went to what they called cold weather training up at Pickle Meadows. It's above San Bernardino in the mountains.
Ooh.
And one night, it was a very heavy snowstorm came in. Well, when I woke up the next morning, I couldn't move my legs.
Oh my goodness.
Had
Frozen.
about a foot and a half of snow on them.
Oh my goodness. That's real cold weather training. It's not.
I was a platoon sergeant at that time, and so all the old timers got a big kick out of us young
Being
people not having any mountain training or anything, and so, but we got out of it and finished our training and back to Pendleton, and then 3,000 of us formed up what was called the 82nd replacement draft, and so that's where we went. From there, San Diego to Yokosuka, Japan, and got outfitted for combat, took another ship then and went into Wonsan in Korea. Got off the ship and there was a train sitting right there beside the dock. I saw this captain and I said, Captain, can you give me some guidance? I gave him my name. I was Staff Sergeant Robert Brown. He said, you belong to me. He said, get on this train. He was Robert Barrows, and later he made 4-star general and Commandant of the Marine Corps.
Wow.
And so he was an outstanding commanding officer. He had done World War II in China as an American advisor for him over there. And so we went up to, went north on the train to what was called Chin Hung Ni. That was at the base of the mountain that went on up to Way City. And that played a big part in '68 when the communists started their offensive, reinforced by Chinese. And we were kind of a rear guard sitting down at the bottom. So if you got any in between there or not, then that's when we got involved with the Chosin Reservoir.
Yeah, tell us that story about the Chosin Reservoir and also about how you earned your Purple Heart, which you're wearing today, which is lovely.
I didn't earn it.
Well, you received it. Chinaman gave it to you, but yes.
Okay. In December of '50, the Chinese were coming across the Yalu River just by the thousands. And they were kind of going to the east of us. So we got the word to move out, to go up the mountain, which we did. We walked, and we got up so far, and the captain says, this is where we go up. And it was called 1081. And we went about halfway up, and the captain said, hold on, we were in a snowstorm at this time. And he said, wait a minute. And I said, what's the matter? My platoon was following him. We had the lead. And he said, I heard something over here that sounded familiar. The first sergeant of the company, I forget his name, he said, I'll go check it out. So about 3 or 4 steps and he disappears because it's snowing. And then we heard a couple of whomp whomps, and he had thrown a couple of hand grenades into a machine gun nest.
Oh, wow.
Which we were very thankful for.
Yes.
So then we went on up to the top of the mountain, and we were above the tree line. We were out it was bare ground on a comb. And we could look off in the distance and see the Chinese coming across. And it was just like if you would pour pepper on something white. It just the way the thickness of it was and so forth. So pretty soon, on the second day, here come 2 Corsairs back from a mission just north of us a little bit, and they thought we were Chinese. Corsairs being a fighter, and they banked around. They made a pass over. We had our air panels out, giving it's a code. They could lay out and diagram, and they see it because it's bright colors. But evidently they didn't see it because they started strafing us.
Oof. Yes.
And they hit one of the companies very hard. And but we would run from one side of the mountain to the other side, getting away from the onslaught of the bullets and so forth. So they had a hard time getting the aircraft out of there. Our air officer supposedly had connection with them, but it didn't work. So he went back to the carrier, and that didn't work. So he went back to Japan.
Oh, to tell
by
them.
Radio.
Right, to get them to stop.
They got his message. They then got in contact with the carrier and finally called the 2 aircraft off. But there was just an awful lot of Charlie Company that just got shot to pieces with 50 and 20 caliber bullets. So. And we stayed up there for 4 days, 40 below zero.
40 below zero?
40 below.
That, wow.
And frostbite was horrible.
Oh.
I lost about half of my platoon to frostbite. A platoon normally is about 42 men. I could never get much more than 30 because of casualties all the time. And they would take, the corpsman would escort the wounded and or the frostbite down the mountain to the service road, and then they had to climb back up again to be sure that they were there to take care of the rest of us then. No chow, because everything was frozen solid. No water, so we ate snow for 4 days.
Wow.
And it didn't hurt us. But we missed chow, though.
The war meal.
Yeah. And at the end of that time then, the reason we were up there was the rest of the 1st Marine Division was coming down, and an Army organization had joined them. Now, they were receiving severe casualties up there. In this one incident, the Army lost over 800.
Oh, my goodness.
And the Chinese just took bulldozers and dug a big hole and just pushed them all into it.
Ugh.
I'll get to that in a little later here. So they came down the service road, and before the Chinese and the North Koreans left, they blew up a bridge that was essential. You couldn't get on down the service road. So they had to fly in structures of a temporary bridge. And it was C-119s, the old flying boxcar. And they would push the stuff out the back end and be parachuted down and would land close, and they got the road fixed. And so the troops had already passed us. We came down at nighttime. You couldn't see 1 foot in front of you, so they said, well, sit down and slide down. So you'd sit down and slide until your feet hit the guy in front of you. And then pretty soon, whoop, you get hit in the back with the guy there. And then start off again. So it took about 2 to 3 hours to get down the mountainside. Wow. So when we did, it was daylight, and the road was just loaded with North Koreans coming down, getting south away from the communists, and Chinese soldiers. And the soldiers were like zombies. And we looked at them, and their legs were about this big around, solid with ice from their waist down. And we looked at them and we said, no, I'm not going to shoot you. You're already dead. And they're just walking. And
terrible.
So we just walked on past them. Our executive officer, his position in our company on the hike was in the rear of the company, and the company commander and the first sergeant was up front. And my 3rd platoon, we were in the rear, and Lieutenant Wilson looked at me and he said, Browning, he said, you keep looking back, because the next person you see coming around that bend is going to be a Chinaman, and you better start shooting. I said, you serious? And he said, yes. Serious.
To be prepared.
So my neck was pretty well twisted to the back all the time then. But then we walked pretty much way down past Chin Hung Knee, where we were based at first. And then transportation was available and took us back down then to Hung Nam, to where we got aboard ships. About 3,000 of us went aboard one ship, which was a merchant ship to carry supplies, not troops.
Not 3,000 men.
Restrooms, mess hall, everything was very small because it was just for their crew. Our diet consisted of beans and rice. Be careful now.
Right, small space.
Restrooms would accommodate probably no individual toilet. It was a trough, and had toilet seats ever so often. That might handle 6 people. And there would maybe about 4 of those aboard ship.
Well, for 3,000.
You got 3,000 troops. Oof. You're eating beans and rice.
I guess, was it better than being shot at when you had to go to the toilet over the river?
Well,
or it's just a different bad?
What ended up happening was, you got up on deck, you turned your butt toward the sea, you dropped your drawers and did your job. I don't know who had to wash your ship afterwards.
I was going to say, that was one dirty ship after that.
These are some of the actual things that does happen in combat.
Yeah,
you
don't have
can't
a choice,
help it.
Right?
So we got down to Hung Nam, and the Army was blowing up the warehouses, which were loaded with different supplies. And we boarded ship and went down to Tucson. And we stayed there about 3 weeks, and then we got orders that we were going to start moving back north again. This entailed a lot of hiking and being transported back up on the mountains again. And we were just south of the 38th parallel. And we run into heavy opposition. And so we was able to hold where we were at. We ended up with what was called Horseshoe Ridge. It was real close to us. The night before, we were getting so much fire from them. My platoon was on the lower left of the horseshoe. Charlie Company was up a little higher. Baker Company was down on the other side. And a tank came up into my perimeter. He said, "Where are they at?" And I said, "They're in front of us." So they loaded up with what's called canister shot, little iron balls. And they started firing. My hearing went out because you just couldn't hear a cotton picking thing. And because the Chinese were great for blowing bugles and whistles and everything when they're attacking, trying to scare you. Well, they found out that they weren't scaring anybody, and so they pulled off. So the next morning, company commander said, "Brown, I want you to take your platoon and go up to that ridge line up there and knock them Chinese out." Well, we might have got a third of the way up until we got shot up pretty bad. I lost about half my platoon, plus myself. And being I got wounded, I had to turn it over to another sergeant and give him all my paperwork that I had on each individual. And my runner was an Indian from Payson, Arizona. When you can't communicate, you have a runner, and I would be on one flank and the lieutenant would be on the other, then you can have them going messages back and forth. So his nickname was Moose. He picked me up in a fireman's carry and throwed me over his shoulder.
So he was a big enough guy to
I said,
carry.
"Moose, put me down, let me crawl." He said, "No, I'll get you down there, don't worry." I said, "Well, I am worrying because I'm watching the ground fly up down to your feet." And he said, "Don't worry about it." So he got me down there. The corpsman bandaged me up, put me in a truck in the back end with about 20 others. And the guy I was sitting with, I got shot in the left hip, so I'm leaning very strongly to the right because it smarted. And the guy sitting next to me, he was shot up just something terrible. He said, "Do you have a Surette?" And I said, "Yeah," and that was a morphine Surette. So we carried him fastened to our collars. So I pulled it off, and he said, "Stick me in the leg." So I stuck him in the leg, and then pretty soon he kind of settled down then. So they took us, and we traveled for quite a distance then to a MASH organization. And it was just like the comedy strip we watched
all
on
the
TV.
people coming in and the doctors, nurses.
The doctors, they were all clowns, but they were very good. It was comical. And it was nighttime, and we were lined up for quite a ways because there was a lot of us that was wounded. Doctor was coming down the line, said, you go to tent so-and-so, and you go over here, and he come to me, and he said, well, you're not that bad off, you can wait a while.
Right.
He said, and the next morning, they took the MASH outfit was on an airstrip. So they put us aboard a C-47. It was rigged for hospitalization. And we flew down to Pusan. And they put us aboard the hospital ship then. And put us in a ward. There must have been 100 patients in this ward.
Wow.
All the nurses were off in a corner shooting the breeze. I held up my hand and motioned forward and said, what do you want? I said, well, I've got nothing on me from my waist down. I'm naked as the day I was born. She laughed. I said, can you get me a towel or something? And she said, yeah. She comes back with a tea towel about like this. What can you do?
Did they have you in a hospital gown, or just
no,
they didn't have any?
Still had my dungaree jacket on.
And that was it.
That was it.
The supplies were low.
Yeah, after we got loaded, then we started headed for Japan. We got about halfway across the China Sea, and one of the screws broke down. The screws being the propellers that propelled the ship. Mm-hmm. There's two of them. And so they had to put some sailors overboard to repair it, because we were just going in a circle out there. And they got it fixed, and then we took off back for Japan then and went to Yokosuka Naval Hospital, Yokosuka, Japan. And I was there probably about 4 or 5 weeks. And learning to get along to try to walk again and so forth. And one morning this Navy nurse come in and he said, Brown, you go into the bathroom, or the head is what the Navy and the Marine calls the bathroom. Says, you start cleaning. I said, I'm sorry, I am a staff sergeant and they do not do that kind of duty. She said, oh yes you are.
Here you are.
And so I went to the head and started cleaning. and we got to where I could function pretty good, and they issued uniforms to us again. And we boarded a ship and headed back to the States in. So,
and that was, you did not go back to Korea. That was,
no,
at that point, you were back
because
in the
I
United
was
States.
in the reserve category at that time, and they said, no, we're going to send you back to the States.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I know that you spent some time at the Philadelphia Navy Yard at the Marine Barracks. That was later, about 1966, 1967. What were your duties when you were at the Philadelphia Navy Yard?
Navy Yard, there is what is called a Marine Barracks, and it is security for the entire Navy base. Well, when the Korean War came along, it was set up to handle the deceased Marines coming back from Korea. And we had what was called an escort duty. Any Marine that was killed east of the Mississippi River to the Atlantic, we escorted home. We were connected with this business of the deceased from an organization in Vietnam to our organization, and the bodies would go through a graves registration in Vietnam, flowing to Pearl Harbor, and go through the final cleanup, put them in uniform, put them in a nice casket, fly them to the States, and then we would pick them up then at the airport.
And you would take them to the families?
Yes,
the escort.
Escorts would assist the families the 2 or 3 days that they would be ready for burial then.
So Bob, you had your service at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And in March 1968 was when you went to Da Nang in Vietnam. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing in Vietnam and what your time was like there.
Okay. Got there in approximately March of 1968. Was assigned to Headquarters Battalion of Camp Brooks. Camp Brooks was named after the first Marine that was killed in Vietnam.
Oh, okay.
And it was a huge supply depot. Anywhere from beans to bullets.
Beans to bullets, that's a lot.
And I had a motor transport company, a communications company, graves registration, and a supply. Graves registration was really the raw base. They come right off a line being killed into this here. A lot of times their buddies would escort them. Even the dogs that were war dogs, if their manager got killed,
they would
come too. And we had a grave registration detachment over on the Laotian border. Periodically, I'd catch a convoy and go over and spend 2 or 3 days with the guys, because handling the KIAs day in, day out, nighttime, and so forth was just a gruesome detail for them.
Yeah.
And
so emotionally hard.
Talk with them and let them know how it's appreciated, the duties that they were performing. But also over there was the Ho Chi Minh Trail coming down.
Yes.
You could see them at nighttime because of the lights on their vehicles. They would be artillery fire going at them. There would be aircraft overhead coming in at nighttime on them. You name it, and they'd still come on down regardless.
Right. That was a.
And I'd stay for 2 or 3 days, and catch another convoy going back over to our base then.
So your main duties were really running the headquarters.
Oh yes, still had the battalion to take care of, and it was strictly guard duty, nighttime, daytime. You'd get rockets coming in. Now, the rockets they were using were 122s. That was approximately 122 pounds of explosive packed into this.
Yeah.
And it did a lot of damage to our base, wounded, killed. One stinking time, one of the dumb things hit the urinal.
Oh, well, stinking is right.
Let everybody know what details are like. But we were able to, because we were even receiving the enemy coming to our barbed wire entanglements around our base at nighttime.
Okay. Trying to get in and, yeah. When did you come back from Vietnam?
Came back in, let's see, retired in April, in March of '49.
Okay, and then was it in April that then you retired?
April the 30th, I retired.
April 30th, 1969. And you had 24 years of active service.
Well, active and inactive, yeah, but
total service.
Yeah.
At that time. And I know that for a while you lived in Pennsylvania, but we're kind of interested in hearing about, in 1991 you decided to move back to Rushville. What kind of, what influenced your decision about moving back to the area that you grew up in?
Honey, there was something about the Hilltop that drew all members of the family back there.
And what is the Hilltop? I mean,
the Hilltop was Granddad Stiers and Grandma Lillie and Grandma Hazel's home. Grandpa farmed, it was about 68 acres, I think it was. And so we would come back to Indiana because Mother and Dad and Carolyn's parents were here, and we'd visit, but we always went to the Hilltop to see it.
And at that point, it was just the old house and barn that was starting to kind of fall down. And
the house had 3 rooms, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. Now you can imagine back in the earlier days when all the kids were there, that took care of all of them.
I don't know where they all slept, as I remember as a kid.
Well, I would say that between the bedroom and the living room,
right, they were all
probably was, yeah. And so after I had worked at the school district for 20 years. And
this is in Levittown, Pennsylvania.
Levittown, Pennsylvania, right. I went from being head groundsman. They had 400 acres in 18 schools. And I went from being the head groundsman to the chief of security and warrant or truant officer, and then director of pupil transportation. We had 10,000 students who we transported.
Wow. Well, you had a great second career. You had a great second career. I mean, after your Marine Corps service,
yes.
You had a whole nother career.
Some of the Marine experiences was helpful. We had to transport the 10,000 kids to 18 different schools, plus a Jewish school and 1 Catholic school. And the Catholics and the Jewish kids didn't get along good on the school buses. So I was on the telephone constantly with a Jewish mother who knew her son was going to grow up and be the Messiah. And
you had to do a lot of negotiating, it sounds like. Problem solving.
Then,
but it sounds like, so after, again, coming back to the Hilltop, and this was a place that you had spent a lot of time as a child, but also when you came home to visit, you would go back to...
We'd go, like I said, out to the Hilltop, and I asked Carolyn once, I said, "What do you think about moving back here?" She said, "I don't know." So she was standing in the doorway of the old house, and the weeds were up to here on her.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think
I was out in the weeds. And I said, we could talk to Chuck and see if he would sell us some acreage here. Well, she said, okay. So we got a hold of Chuck, and I said, "Chuck, how about 10 acres of the Hilltop?" He said, "How about $20,000? I said, "How about forgetting it?"
Too much. Now, Chuck is actually my father's brother.
Brother, right. Chuck was a cousin.
And they inherited, when my grandfather died, they inherited some acreage that included the Hilltop property. So I said, "Well, how about 5 acres?" Then he came down in price to $10,000. I said, "Okay, I can handle that." So we bought the Hilltop, the house and the barn, and 5 acres. So
we had a fence put up to begin with. Contacted Alan Stiers, a cousin of ours, in Anderson, who was a contractor. And I said, we're looking at a modular, but we want some other buildings. And he said, we think we can do that. So.
Well, you have the house, which is quite lovely, but you also put sort of a barn-like structure back up.
We have our tractors and storage in it and so forth. And,
but there's also a special sign.
John Deere.
Well, John Deere, yeah. But on the barn, you have a special sign.
The what?
On your barn.
Oh, the sign.
You have a
yes.
special sign.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I had a sign made. Grandpa named it the Hilltop. So I had the sign made with the Hilltop, and my Ben F. Stiers Sr., my grandfather, established us around September, I think it was 1920. And traffic still slows down yet today for people to read the sign on the side of the barn.
And we're almost at the 100-year
I'd like to live that long to be able to see that.
That's soon. Just to kind of wrap up, I know that since you've been back here, that you've been very active in working with veterans, and that one of the things that you helped establish was the Veterans Park here in Rushville. And tell us a little bit about why that was important to you. And
well, Rushville, I can think way back to when I was a small child, always turned out for every veteran's function. Mother and I would walk out to East Hill Cemetery on Memorial Day. As time went on, and of course I went in the Marines and out, joining the Legion and the VFW. I just felt that I needed to work with veterans. And I was commander of the VFW for 11 years. Couldn't get anybody to step up to take over, so I just kept
doing it. Yes,
So,
that happens. Who had the idea of establishing the park?
Okay, the bridge up here, we call it, it was a bridge across a little creek up north of town. Mark Ellis was a good friend of ours. He was a veteran of World War II. He was a B-24 bomber pilot in Europe. And he and I hit it off real good, and we'd have coffee together and talk over old times. And he got doodling on a napkin one day. And he drew a picture of a bridge. He said, we need a bridge over the creek dedicated to veterans. I said, okay. Now this was probably 1999. And we were making contacts around about the bridge. We'd go to Anderson and talk to a company that was iron instructor or instructional company. Finally, we got everything put together, and in July of 2000, when the Rush County Fair came to town, we had also in the meantime contacted the traveling wall of all of the KIAs in Vietnam. So we had that set up.
Oh, wow.
And now this was during the county fair, and it drew people from everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Then Mark got the idea that we needed some place to put memorabilia during the fair.
Oh, okay.
Again, he and I were having coffee, and he got a napkin, and he drew display cases. He and I said, okay. And he said, well, I can make them. So he made about 6 of them. Very good size, plexiglass on the front. Both sides you could hang up, and we invited people to bring all the war memorabilia and put it in there on displays. And all 6 cases on both sides were covered with everything.
When did the bridge get finished, and when was that dedication?
It was early 2000 that it was completed, and the dedication. Mark has since passed away.
Oh, that's
and
that. A nice
every
legacy.
Memorial Day we have our ceremony up there. Veterans Day we have another ceremony there. 4th of July we usually form up around the park area and then go down through town with everybody and everything.
Right. So. As part of that celebration. Well, we're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I'd just like to ask you sort of one more last question, which is sort of, is there any message you'd like to give to younger people who are thinking about joining the military, or just younger folks in general, sort of about your service, or any last thoughts?
I have always tried to inform young people, and I get to go to the schools every once in a while to do the same thing. And I says, do you have any idea what you want to do when you get out of high school? And they would say 9 times out of 10, they say no. I said, why don't you consider going in one of the branches of the service? I said, go put 2 years in. And then if you want to go to college, come back and go to college. You'll be much more mature and more apt to pay attention to your instruction at that time. And I says, military life is good. I said, there's nothing there other than combat that you'd be hurt. But through your training, you would accept that even and not even give it a second thought. I said, there's so many schools and technical work that needs to be done by you young people that has got the knowledge that you could learn it and easy. And so I've talked to some, and they have gone in, come back and thanked me. Rush County has a group of young people they get in every summer for a work project. And they come from all over the country. This year there was students come from Canada.
Oh, wow.
And so they asked me if I would have a few words to say to the young people. So I just encouraged them to be good citizens, to love their flag, and honor their veterans and so forth. And it's been that I had just had a birthday.
You're just young.
And they all got up and sang happy birthday to me. So I had a great day.
Well, Bob, it's been an honor talking to you today.
Okay.
Thank you so much as always.
Okie doke.
And really appreciate it. And
right.
look forward to talking to you more.
Okie doke.